So good evening, everyone. This is a wonderful opportunity. I'm so excited to welcome all of our participants that are going to be speaking tonight, who I'll introduce shortly, and to all the audience members joining us for this great event, part of the Words Festival. My name is Dr. Shannon Arntfield, and I have the pleasure of welcoming three awesome individuals who are going to join us for a bit of an unstructured kind of jam session as it relates to the art of resilience. And thank you to the contributors and the partners, which I'll acknowledge near the end of the event by name. To try and locate us right now, we have Dr. Ron Epstein, Dr. Jillian Horton, and Molly Peacock joining us as panelists to speak about the broad themes here of the human side of medicine, the continuum between the head and the heart, and the intersection between art and suffering. That's the broad overview of what we're here to talk about tonight. And to give a brief but very incomplete introduction to each of our speakers, I'm going to introduce them by way of some of their works. So Jillian Horton spoke with us actually at Western at Grand Rounds in March of this year about her book, We Are All Perfectly Fine. And Jillian is a physician, an educator, and a very close colleague with Dr. Epstein, who I'll introduce momentarily. To segue into Dr. Epstein, this is one of his books. Dr. Epstein would be recognized as an expert in the areas of mindfulness, medicine, and runs a retreat center that is featured actually in Dr. Horton's book in her discussion about sort of her experiences in healthcare. And there's many connections between both these speakers and Molly. And I'll just feature one of Molly's books here, The Analyst, and recognize her as a poet and a writer. Actually featured, one of her books was featured in the Globe and Mail as the book of the year. And the intersectionality between our panel's speakers tonight, between literature, medicine, and mindfulness, I think is where we are joining you as an audience. And I think to recognize our audience as well, that we are speaking in the midst of those who provide healthcare, those who are receiving healthcare, and attending to those receiving healthcare as caregivers themselves. And the third group is those who are educating and attempting to lead in the spaces in which healthcare is carried out. So I just want to acknowledge all the people joining in on the chat, telling us where you're from, anywhere from Galliano, BC, one of the Gulf Islands, all the way out to Halifax. We've got representation from the whole country right now. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to our panelists. As the last word before we get into everything, just to acknowledge my role as a moderator, really what I'm trying to do tonight is help this jam session conversational space to manage our time, to manage the relationship between our speakers, and to support the conversation both between them, but also between you and them through the Q&A portion. We're going to speak for about 60 minutes. We're going to have conversation with our audience members for the next 30 minutes, for a total of 90 minutes or so tonight. And for those members of the audience wishing to ask questions, you can just put them into the Q&A rather than the chat. I will attempt to review those, and Josh in the background is going to attempt to help me do that, and we'll do some moderated question and answer period at the end. So that is our introduction, and I'm so glad to help start this conversation. So I'm going to start things off by acknowledging that the delta between the need for compassion and the recognition of our humanity is probably never been greater. And yet the spaces for and the ability to achieve that has been potentially as difficult as it's ever been in the last 18 months of this pandemic. And I wonder if we could start the conversation today by talking about the ways in which the pandemic shifted or changed the conversation, influenced the conversation about resilience, about suffering, and about meaning in healthcare. And Jillian, you started us off in March. I wonder if you'd be willing to take whatever aspect of that question you feel inclined to speak to and start us off in conversation.
Well, thank you, Shannon. You've really given me a nice carte blanche to just say whatever I feel like saying. And the first thing I want to say is just that I'm really grateful to be here. First of all, Western, as many of you know, has a very special place in my heart. It was a key place where I spent my formative years, not becoming a physician, but laying the brickwork, I think, for becoming a writer. And I had so many important mentors at Western. One of them was Molly's late husband, Michael Groden, such an important figure in my life and development. And Molly also had a huge impact on me as a writer. And then I'm also here today with Ron Epstein, who's had a tremendous impact on the trajectory of my career and the ways in which it has evolved in the last few years. So as I just take that all in, what I find myself thinking about is how everything is connected, often in surprising ways that don't manifest for a long time. So, your question about compassion, I think, is where I will start. And, those of you who heard me speak at Western, and anybody who knows me knows that one of the most formative experiences in my life was growing up with a profoundly disabled sister. I always say that was my real medical education. And through my observations, even at a very young age, and subsequently all through my medical training and career, I've come to believe that compassion is a choice. It is an emotional and cognitive stance. And definitely there are things that influence our development of it, like anything that we develop during the course of our life. But I do believe that in general, every day when we show up in healthcare, it is a choice that we make, whether we are going to engage in a generally pro-social way, whether we are going to choose gratitude, whether we are going to choose to meet people with warmth and compassion in our hearts. Now, there have been many things during the pandemic that have tested that, and medicine has already, as you alluded to, for increasingly in the last few decades, become a hostile environment for the cultivation of a lot of those things. We're working against a lot of counter forces, trying to develop a very relational stance, and medicine is often working in opposition to the things that demand efficiency, or in the United States, that precious RVU, the relative value unit. But I still think at the end of the day, we do have that locus of control. We do choose how we want to present ourselves. Many things will challenge that. We won't always be perfect. We have to have self-compassion for the times when we do not live up to our own standards. But that is the first place where I begin. And I have a lot more after to say about the system and resilience and what it does to us and everything else. But for me, that is a fundamental. This is still a choice that I make. And by making that choice, I do exert some control over how I carry myself in this medical world.
Yeah, no, beautiful, beautiful comments, Jillian. The idea that that it is a choice. I wonder, Ron or Molly, do you want to riff off anything that Jillian's started us off with, or can I help continue directing this?
Well, I mean, sure. I have some responses to Jill. First of all, it's wonderful to be on a Western panel with Jill. I heard her speak in March, and that was one of the last times that my husband was able to attend a Zoom session. So Professor Michael Groden heard his student Jill, and it was a very moving experience. So I'm just responding to that and responding to her idea that compassion is a choice. I do think that we can choose our feelings while at the same time acknowledging what it is we feel. Do you know? Because the feeling we choose is not necessarily the feeling that we feel. And the disjunct between those two, I think, takes a certain amount of consciousness. So I would almost think that compassion is also a kind of development. And I say that as a poet. and as a biographer, as someone who's been writing for many decades, when I think of what the main constituent of resilience is, particularly in a pandemic, but really in any sort of daily life, as we lurch from crisis to crisis, for me, it's making something in some conscious way. And for me, of course, it's making art, but frankly, it could also just be making a sandwich. That sense of attending to something that you're doing that gives you some control contributes to resistance. And I think that relates to what Jillian is saying about compassion being a choice. So I'll stop there.
Well, I love that, Molly. And I think that Ron would have a lot to say in that intersection you just raised about choosing our feelings. And that requires first knowing what we're feeling and acknowledging it. I feel like you have a lot to say about that.
I just want to take a step back from being compassionate to what you notice, okay? Because compassion starts with noticing suffering in particular. And as physicians, we're trained in a particular way to identify particular kinds of suffering a little bit more easily than other kinds of suffering. And one kind of suffering that I think has been paramount during the past 20 months or so has been the suffering of isolation. And this is just on many planes that, working in, I'm a palliative care physician. And so when I'm on service in the hospital, taking care of very sick people who may be at the end of life, just palpably feeling the absence of their loved ones there. So that's one thing that's really different. At least at the hospital I work at, when patients are really that sick, their families are usually there. I mean, maybe 2/3, 3/4 of patients, there's a family member there. And so it was just this sense of absence and this sense of bleakness. And so how to, but it requires noticing not just something that is there, but something that's not there. What things that should be there, that kind of absence, that space, and to not ignore it. And then the absence of seeing the lower half of people's faces. So this is what we've been seeing in work settings all the time, and so learning to notice more subtlety around people's eyes, where their gaze is, how open their eyes are, whether a little, wrinkles in the forehead, just so that our attention is really focused in a different way. This Zoom format that we've all grown accustomed to and love and hate at the same time allows us a view of the of like the shoulders up. So, this is kind of an extraordinary thing to do. I'm actually standing up. Now you can see other parts of me. So this is kind of a radical act, okay? So, and yes, I am wearing pants and I'm not wearing pajamas. But just thinking about what we notice and where our field is constrained. And so, the other piece of compassion that for me has been awakened in a discomforting way has been all of the racial tension in the US over the past couple of years that have coincided to some degree with the pandemic. But just in the way that you notice skin color, the way that you notice ethnicity and signs of likeness and difference among people is something that I think for all of us has been another parallel stream. And we know that it takes more of an act of imagination to be compassionate towards someone who we perceive as very different from us. And that's a challenge that I think we all face, that it's really harder to understand, if someone speaks a different language, for example, it's harder to understand the nuance of the feelings that people are trying to express. So I think some of that tension and divide and violence actually in this country has to do with the way that people notice likeness and difference, and then how they respond to it. If they respond to it with a sense of threat or a sense of warmth and generosity. So I know it sounds a little rambly, but all of this really has to do with what you notice and how you can voluntarily adopt a point of view that's different from your usual point of view, and how you practice doing that, because I don't think it comes naturally. I think it's something that we actually have to practice. What's the world like through Jill's eyes? What's the world like through Molly's eyes? What's the world like through Shannon's eyes? So that act of imagination, I think, is also another ingredient of being able to be compassionate. It's Martha Nussbaum talks about the imaginative reconstruction of someone else's experience. That's kind of putting it a bit in cognitive terms, but also we are also imagining or envisioning or embodying the emotional lives of others in some way, either accurately or inaccurately. And it's just the willingness to engage in that kind of connection with someone that allows for compassion to emerge, even if we want it to. Okay, so the wanting isn't enough. It's what we attend to that really matters.
Thank you so much to each of you for these opening sort of comments. And I can just see 100 ways this conversation could flow. I suspect both Jill and Molly have some automatic things that have been coming to them about how they wish. I don't want to get in the way. I have a lot of thoughts that came up for myself as well. Instead of inserting myself, can I ask Jill or Molly, do either of you wish to sort of jump in on some of the things that have been shared so far?
Well, noticing, I mean, since we're tying medicine and literature, and I'm from the literature end, often when people try to make something or write something, they're grappling with something ineffable, something that they don't quite understand. And I think that attaches to some of what Ron was saying when he was talking about the imaginative life and imagining our way into someone else. And frankly, imagining our way into ourselves to discover ourselves. And I have often said to someone struggling with a piece of writing, just notice everything. You don't have to draw a conclusion if you're noticing. You can be in a completely unbalanced, disruptive state and quite unsure of yourself and not knowing what you're doing. And if you start noticing, the details that you notice start to accumulate and start to take a shape. And you don't have to struggle to make a conclusion. You start shaping your experience. So I just wanted to say that what I think the three of us are talking about is that imagination and noticing, and then compassion or noticing feelings, to making a practice of that. We can come to it from a lot of different places in our lives. I happen to come from a place of literature, but that capacity to notice, simply to observe, and we all have this. Think of all of us now, how we didn't know when we first started wearing masks whether someone was smiling, and how we all have observed enough of people's eyes and the wrinkles around them and their eyebrows to know when they're smiling. It's just that capacity for observation, I think, that is so incredibly helpful.
And Jillian, any thoughts that you have that you're at the tip of your tongue that you want to share? I have a question probably for the three of you based on what's come up so far, but I recognize all the connections between you, Jillian, and Molly and Ron, and I suspect you have a lot on your mind already.
I think it's really just bringing it all together that compassion is a creative act. I mean, June Callwood talked about the compassionate imagination, and I often think that that is what we are really harnessing when we try to, as Ron said, observe how things make us feel, what we notice in other people's affects, what we see in our environments. And then, this is, of course, and I know you believe this too, Shannon, because you work at the interface of the health humanities. One of the things we hope to do when we introduce students in the health professions to literature, or even, God forbid, when we bring people with literary backgrounds into the health professions like myself, is, we're hoping to continue to flex that same muscle, the one that asks us to parse when we are undergraduates doing English courses. What did the little details floated out to us here by the narrator tell us about what the person might be feeling, thinking, observing? I mean, a lot of our training when we study literature really is in noticing. And of course, those are the threads that Rita Sharon has tied together for her narrative medicine program, and the thing that she's tried to make us all more aware of in her work in the last few decades. So I just think, again, we so often find symmetry, parallel ideas that are expressed slightly differently, but at the end of the day, pulsing beneath it all is creativity, awareness, self-awareness, compassion for others.
So in relation to that, and Ron, I'm thinking about just some ties between sort of where the three of you have, the ties between the place each of you is coming from right now. The question that comes to mind is, how do we notice and not get overwhelmed? And I'm thinking here, this idea of suffering and isolation that you brought up, Ron. My husband's one of the ICU physicians, and his role in the unit as the pandemic was starting and going on, and helping bring home to me this understanding of these nurses who would be alone, just as I'm sure you were, on, with a patient who is dying. And that nurse is the only person to witness what's happening. And she's doing it on behalf, or he's doing it on behalf of the family, and trying to be this bridge. And there's so much to notice. And I believe a common potential misconception is that the act of noticing, in fact, we are prompted to almost deny what we're noticing because of the fear of overwhelm. And I wonder if any of you would like to speak to that.
Well, I can start, and I guess just on a personal level, I had a meditation practice before I started medicine. And part of what you learn when you sit quietly by yourself in a rather somewhat unstructured way is that there's always a parade of thoughts and feelings going on. Whether or not you notice them in everyday life, they're kind of there. They're kind of influencing your thoughts and actions. So I think that in a way, that kind of awareness that that we have the capacity to take in large amounts of information and then make choices about how to manage that information, for me was something that came with meditation practice. But I think there are other ways of getting there as well, that there are ways of, in a way, each stimulus that you have opens up a choice for you in terms of how you want to respond. And we're always making those choices in a kind of below the awareness level. But if we can kind of bring those choices just a little bit closer to the level of awareness, then we begin to experience a state of emotional regulation. That is, we can begin to regulate the degree to which we construct emotions out of experiences. And here I'm referring to the work of a psychologist named Lisa Feldman Barrett, who has done some really interesting work on what she calls the formation of emotions. There's a book that she wrote called How Emotions Are Made. And her thesis is that emotions aren't primary. That is, that we take in sensations, we have bodily experiences, we take in visual stimuli and auditory stimuli. And in our process of trying to make sense out of them, we construct emotions. So that it's kind of a radical idea. But I think the thing that I take away from that is that we actually do have some choice on some level about how we feel. Okay, so emotions aren't things that happen to us. They're actually things that we're actively constructing in response to experiencing the world in some way. So when I'm with a patient, I can distinguish between the tragedy of the situation that I'm witnessing and what might or might not be a helpful response for the patient and also for me in terms of my ability to respond to that patient. So I think I think we all learn that in a certain way in order to adapt to situations of intense suffering. You said earlier on that this is, unprecedented. I actually don't think it is. I mean, there was the flu pandemic in 1918. There was the AIDS epidemic. I was a medical student during the early days of the AIDS epidemic and a resident, and we didn't really know how AIDS was spread. We didn't, a lot of doctors were unwilling to take care of patients even at risk for HIV because of that level of fear. And part of it is a certain kind of alchemy of the ability to transform fear into curiosity. And so when I'm feeling afraid or feeling threatened or feeling overwhelmed, just the ability to insert a little bit of curiosity to that. Well, why is this happening? Is there some way I could look at the situation in a different way? Stepping outside of myself and observing myself as if I were someone else, a process called decentering. So I think we have various psychological ways of helping ourselves navigate situations of intense stress. And also, as Viktor Frankl would point out, just the ability to find meaning even in the most horrific of adversity, that there are things that can't be taken away from us. And part of that is our ability to regulate our own experience, our own interpretation. So that's a lot of what I try to teach when I'm doing mindful practice workshops, or not teach, but I guess create fertile soil within which that set of abilities of emotional recognition and self-regulation can actually emerge. And it's my belief that that is really fundamental to being a good doctor, in as much as knowing the Krebs cycle or how to do various technical procedures. I think the practice of emotional self-regulation without disconnection, but remaining engaged, but also regulated, I think is something that distinguishes really good doctors from the rest of the crowd.
Jillian, I see you nodding there. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree so emphatically with everything Ron said, and particularly that last part. We often, and I've written about this elsewhere, that we treat people who are really well self-regulated and who provide care that is experienced as really present and really compassionate. We do have sort of this hidden curriculum piece where so often that's framed as like an optional, it's like you go to the restaurant and do you want this side dish of compassion? And, we know that when we look at, for example, our, in Canada, regulatory body for fellows, the Royal College, being having those kinds of communication skills, if we want to lump them in there, although they're more than that also, it's fundamental. It's one of the core requirements, a core competency. And too often we've allowed for a different narrative, the narrative, well, that you can be a good doctor because you're a good technician or you know a lot of information without those other things. And to me, that is a narrative that we have to continue to reject. And there are different ways that we can elevate the importance of that work and reject the messaging, because typically what we get when we say we need those things, people say, well, are you saying that the cognitive and critical thinking part of medicine isn't as important? And don't get caught up in that narrative, in that conversation is always my advice, because we're not saying that at all. So really resisting that sort of false dichotomy that people so often create. And the other thing that Ron said that I really relate to, and I've thought this as well, you know, in some ways, there are aspects of this pandemic experience for us that are totally novel. I mean, obviously, I was a resident in Toronto during SARS. And so for about 4 or 5 months, we cared for people wearing masks. None of us have ever lived through a period in North America where we were wearing masks for, 2 years and had some of these unique considerations. But I agree with Ron that when we go where it's a bit deeper, what we are delving into is the experience of deep suffering, uncertainty, chaos. And these are all elements to varying degrees that are familiar to us. I know that, I find myself thinking of Molly and Mike's ongoing health challenges. He lived with those for decades, right? That kind of uncertainty, the feeling that would a shoe drop, would a shoe not drop? And I think what is different a little bit about the pandemic, it's that we're all going through that we're cycling at slightly different times, but we are experiencing it simultaneously on parallel tracks. And then the second thing is volume, and what I sometimes find myself thinking is that a lot of my colleagues, it's the sheer volume of suffering that's relentless. And what Ron also said, what is absent, the families, the silence, the unnatural aspects of wards that are usually very animated and bustling are not, they have a different quality. But what we are fundamentally being asked to do in this moment, aside from that separate piece early in the pandemic where we really had reality-based fears of acquiring this disease at work without knowing even what it was, what we're being asked to do is qualitatively not so different than what we have always been asked to do, in my mind, which is engage deeply, be present with suffering, to not turn away, but turn towards. And I find there's comfort when we think of it, when we think of it that way, that there are other tremendously difficult things in our lives that we've faced that have required these same skills, this same kind of contending with uncertainty and fear, just that the volume, the pacing, some of those things are a bit different. I find that that's a helpful reframe for me.
If you don't mind, you're as you were speaking, I do need to insert a small corrective here, or maybe a big corrective, which is that this process of being compassionate, being attentive, transforming fear into curiosity, none of us can do that alone. Okay, that is, it is virtually impossible to do that in an environment that doesn't nurture any of those qualities. It's very, very difficult. And so the importance of community is paramount. And whether your community is virtual with people around the world, or if it's in person with someone who's your next door neighbor, you need to have some sense of connection to others who are involved in a similar kind of struggle. So.
I actually, in the analyst, at the end of one of the last line of one of the poems in the analyst is, "We can't do this alone." I just want to respond to some of the things that I've been hearing, and be also quite personal, because I'm here as a long-term caregiver as well as a writer, and I just wanted to talk a bit about inserting curiosity and decentering, and that wonderful expression, compassion isn't a side dish, and finding ways to go into deep suffering and chaos. And it brings me back to the beginnings of the past two conversations and trying to figure out what the relationship is between noticing and being overwhelmed. And how can you notice when you're overwhelmed? And being overwhelmed has a general feel to it. I mean, it's over you. And noticing has a specific feel to it, a particular feel. Noticing really means you have to bring your attention to something. And I just make that distinction because I do think that it's something that people, when they speak about mindfulness, are talking about, and certainly when you're talking about just writing down an experience you've had. And also, I have to say that my own pandemic experience has to do with living through the final illness and the death of my husband, who lived with stage 4 melanoma for 40 years, a very, very unusual case. And we lived with an overwhelming illness for a long, long time, and lived on 2 tracks. We led the 2-track life, the death worst case track and the life track. The track where you try to buy life insurance, with your and the track where you're overwhelmed by death. All of those things mixed in our lives all the time. And at the end, my husband chose to die through the MAID process, the medical assistance in dying process. And it brings me to that blue hospice room in Princess Margaret Hospital, Cancer Center, and the ways in which my husband was able to notice, and I was able to notice just those very particular small things. And I know that as his time of death was determined, he knew that this intervention was going to happen at 2:00. We sat there together as if we were in an airport, because we had a suitcase beside us, because I have a shoulder problem and I needed to take things home. And so I thought, well, I'll bring a roll-aboard suitcase. We were there, and there was a big, big blue clock on the wall. And there's a clock and a chair and a bed and a suitcase, and we're talking. And I thought, what possibly can I do in this situation that is so overwhelming, so in some ways bizarre, so deeply compassionate? I mean, I do think that the MAID process is the most compassionate area of contemporary medicine, at least from my point of view, having recently witnessed this. And I thought, I pulled out a piece of paper and I thought, I can just write down what I see. And so often that act, as you're talking about, for instance, a nurse in the final moments of someone's life thinking, I'm going to have to report this to the person's family. It's simply those teeny tiny noticings, that those couple of words that get said, however bizarre sometimes they are, sometimes of course no words are spoken, there's some gesture, but there's a something, and the details of life are life. The details of life prevent the overwhelm.
Molly, we should just drop the mic right now. That was unbelievable. That was just unbelievable. I think that I feel like if we were in a live audience room with each other, you would have been able to hear a pin drop with what you were just sharing. Thank you so very much. Jillian or Ron, would you like to chime in on this point of the conversation?
I want to just comment on Molly's courage to tell her story about the death of her husband. It's just very, very moving. But I think that those kind of narratives really need to be central to the formation and education of anyone in healthcare, because, I mean, you might learn what medications to use, and in a communication skills course, you might be given an option of various phrases you could say. But it's really the assimilation of that experience that enriches you and actually strengthens you. I think just hearing those stories not only exposes human vulnerability and but also human strength. And so when talking about how to deal with that sense of being overwhelmed, in a way that's practice. It's kind of when you vicariously live through a story like that, you're actually practicing that kind of strength building that enables you to face and tolerate suffering the next time around. So that, I think that's, you really have done a great service by sharing that. So that's really, I couldn't think of a better example. I also just wanted to comment on my own connection to London, Ontario, which is that was the home of a family physician named Ian McWhinney, who I visited and got to know reasonably well in the 1990s, especially, who really wrote incredibly eloquently about the nature of healing in the face of suffering, and really was one of those people who really distinguished between making a diagnosis and understanding someone's experience of being ill. I mean, it would make perfect sense that those are somewhat different things, but in medicine up to that point, it had evolved to a point where the making of diagnoses had virtually totally eclipsed any attention to the patient's experience. And it also reminds me that things have really changed in a radically positive way since the 1970s, 80s, 90s, when that biomedical hegemony was at its worst. I think that the idea of narrative medicine hadn't emerged. The idea of the word, I don't think I ever heard the word compassion when I was a medical student. And I'm sure even if students now might have a superficial understanding of what it might be, at least the word is there somewhere in medical education. The word mindfulness, I mean, 3/4 of medical schools have some thing that they do in the name of mindfulness. So I actually, it gives me, the state of the world is pretty concerning, but it does give me some optimism that these values and that people are noticing are pointing their attention to the experiencing of illness as opposed to just the categorizing and naming of it.
Great, thank you for that, Ron. And Jillian, I'm sure you have some thoughts about what's been getting shared.
I find that so often and I say this as a person who, in my family, we've had a lot of illness and a lot of tragedy. I come from a family where we have a genetic defect known as Lynch syndrome. So there's been a very disproportionate burden of cancer relative to what just chance would provide as well. And I think often, just aligned with what Molly says, um, when we come to medicine without those experiences, when we've had those experiences, very often they've been our most powerful teachers. But when we've never had an experience like that, we so often we misread what people actually want from us, what patients actually want. And, sometimes it's true, especially when we come in with very simple problems. You go with a broken bone, your expectation is that your doctor will fix it. You go in with kidney failure, heart failure, a low-grade hematologic malignancy, and you're in your 90s, and your expectation of what that physician can provide may be completely different, but the physician is still often in that fixing mindset and has the stance of that they are here to fix something. They're not seeing it more existentially. And I think so often when we adjust our expectations, and of course there's all kinds of texture to this and all kinds of nuance, but what I have experienced as a family member is we want someone to see our loved one. We want someone to take them in, not just with gratuitous expressions of concern or formulaic sayings, as Ron said. We want them to behave authentically in a way that suggests that they are moved without being overwhelmed. I don't think there are very many families out there who would say that they want their care providers to be crushed by their the death of their loved one or the serious illness of their loved one, but they want them to be moved. And it is not that difficult. It's just that we've made it really difficult to allow yourself to experience the emotions associated with bearing witness, being fully present, being yourself, being fully, allowing your true self to show up in that room instead of some sort of deconstructed version that you have created in the name of professionalism or what you were taught to believe is true professional identity, sort of scrubbed of all the interesting parts. So I think that's another thing, and it's certainly one of the most important messages I like to reinforce to medical learners and residents is, really think about what it is that people need from you. Yes, they need your skill, and back to that piece of our, critical thinking and our academic talents. They need those things, but there's a whole other piece that we've made a lot more complicated than it has to be. They need us to learn how to show up, how to be there, how to feel moved, how to show that we're moved again in a way that we don't overshadow, we don't overwhelm, but it can be felt by everyone who is present. And it's just a shame that we have, it's like when we raise children, we can make things on their developmental trajectory really complicated by interfering with them. We can suggest that basic things about their development, their weight, their height, their eye color, that there's something wrong, that it would be better if they were different, and we really can screw kids up that way. And I think it has a lot in common with medical education. We've disrupted a lot of what should be just natural, organic processes by inserting ideas that really aren't compatible with how we actually tend to live, evolve, feel, express, and feel the most fulfillment.
Lovely, lovely. And it happens that you as a panel are addressing some of the questions that are already being placed into the chat, into the Q&A just spontaneously. To echo Josh's background comments here, that there is going to be time for questions. And if people are developing some, please feel free to put them in, not into the chat, but into the Q&A, and I'll try and moderate that 30 minutes the best we can. Time, as we knew, was going to fly by. We have about 10 minutes left for this panel before we hit some questions and answers. And I want to return, if we can, to something raised a little while ago, which is this idea that we can't do it alone, which I think is a really imperative. And I appreciate the moment you gave that, Ron, to point it out. Several of the audience members I know are from our peer-to-peer wellness program, which started at Schulich it was going to be starting anyway, and then the pandemic started, and it was particularly helpful as we tried to come alongside one another and be present for our colleagues, recognizing that physicians are a challenging group to first acknowledge that they are struggling, and secondarily to tell that to anyone else. And so the Peers to Peers program started as a way of being present for one another. I wonder if one of you or all of you would like to comment on what it is that we can do for and with one another in this idea of not doing it alone. How does that actually happen? What does that look like? How can medicine be a space in which that is, how can space be made for that in the medical culture? Jillian, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. It's a wonderful question and a key question. And I think we can think about it on two levels. And the first level is we can simply look and say, what does the literature tell us about this? And there are a few things that come to mind. One is we know that leaders set the tone. So if we have leaders who are highly relational, who encourage us to exist in community, who want to strengthen the relationships between us, who understand that this is a key determinant, not just of our well-being and fulfillment in our work environments, but also influences patient outcomes. I mean, this is something that is difficult for us to address from the bottom up, but certainly from the top down, really honing in on the criticality of choosing the right leaders and choosing people who are focused on those things. And then the second thing is, there are steps that we can take, and you've talked about one, a peer-to-peer support program, lots of other things in the literature. We all know about, in medicine, commensality programs, or many of us who work in the area of physician burnout, simply arranging for meals to be shared. This is an evidence-based initiative. You do it in a certain way, with the department pays for the meals, and the questions that are discussed at these meals are scripted. But we know that this is a powerful intervention that reconnects people with their sense of meaning and purpose. And why? Because it restores that community piece. And of course, the program that Ron and his colleague Mick Krasner and others have developed at the University of Rochester. I wrote my book, and one of the premises of the book, of course, is that mindfulness was transformative for me, and it was. But what else healed me? Community, being present with other colleagues, finally realizing, not just knowing, but deeply understanding and believing that our suffering is quite universal, that the things that I always felt were terminally unique about me, all the things that we, all experience, imposter syndrome and uncertainty and everything else, that every single person in that room at that retreat, no matter how senior they were, whether they came from one of the best known hospitals in the world or some small rural place where they were practicing solo, that those experiences were universal. And you can only discover that in a community, in a high functioning community. You can hear it before that, you can read it, but I don't think you can know it until you feel it and experience it. So those are, key opportunities that I wish every physician, every healthcare provider of any stripe had an opportunity to engage with, as long as those experiences, I think, have to be taught by highly skilled people. The information and the content and the approach has to be really sophisticated, or you lose physicians, because we are a really tough crowd. You lose us early and you don't get us back. But I think those are some key pathways forward, and they are things that are grounded in the literature as well.
Lovely. Thank you, Jillian. In the 6 minutes remaining before Q&A, Ron or Molly, do you want to chime in there?
I just want to say that the connection that Jill is making between knowing and feeling, I feel is an absolutely vital one. And certainly it is displayed so well in her book and in the specific examples that she gives in her book. In the Analyst is the story of a person myself, who was in long-term therapy as a support, as an emotional support, and to find a way to be a whole human being in view of my caregiver responsibilities, and also because of my dad's alcoholism, my sister's drug addiction, a lot of those unbalancing ideas and decentering things. So I'm going to read a tiny bit of a poem called The Analyst Draws, because what happened was my analyst had a stroke. The idea that you can't do things alone. Sometimes community is a community of two. It is that doctor-patient relationship. And the person who had been helping me could no longer help me. And through a fluke, reached out, and I was able to reconnect with her after her stroke when she had very little language, but she could draw. And she returned to a skill that she had as a child and began drawing. And to see the person who helped me through language, then without language, begin to draw and draw shapes, showed a kind of resilience, just to return us to resilience. That was an example to me in one of those rare turnarounds of the caregiver and care receiver, and being able to return some of that to her. And I just say, brushes you exchanged for words, drawing from what you heard, the lines of your patients' inner lives, teasing out patterns for the easing of the aching you saw. So now, please draw as I was drawn to you, as you drew me to you, till I could walk away, as you now draw away.
Oh, Molly, this is just awesome. This has just been awesome. Thank you. The ability to hear and be with poetry, with writing, with witnessing in this space. What a privilege. Thank you for what you're allowing and inviting. Ron, do you want to make any comments as we move through here?
I guess just a pragmatic one, and just as a clinician and also as a teacher, I don't like the situations in which I interact with students are usually in clinical situations, on the wards, et cetera. And so what is it in terms of the questions that I ask or the conduct that I have just in the moment that's going to really communicate this kind of human sensibility? So one thing that I do is when a student starts a rotation, I'll say, in the hospital here, the patients will see there are always 4 patients you need to consider with each case. There's the person in the bed, there's their family, there's the referring team, because we're a consultation service. So, and then there's yourself. And all 4 of those need care and attention and understanding. And depending upon the case, it might be the patient that needs the most care, or it might be the referring team, or it might be the family, and it might be you. And so when we're talking about patient care, we're going to talk about all 4 of those. And all of that is fair game. And so just by simply setting that as an expectation of saying that the inner life of this student is worthy of my attention as a senior physician. My intention is to say that that person has intrinsic value, and their experience, understanding their own personal experience, is as important as understanding the diagnosis that the patient has, in terms of, not just in terms of being right or being wrong, but in terms of really being of help to that person. So, so that's just one small example, or just telling students, what I want to hear is not only what your formulation is, but also the thoughts and feelings that led up to that. So, and even if those are dead ends, and even if they were misapprehensions and misunderstandings, it's important for us just to have that be as part of the dialogue, because those are the places where we kind of go astray and then find ourselves back and kind of reorient ourselves. And that process also deserves some attention. Again, saying explicitly that this inner life of being a person, of being a human being, is essential to your training. And we're going to actually look at that together. Okay, it's not just philosophy, it's what we're actually going to do with our time. And I think that's really important. There have been any number of ethics and humanities and literature courses, and if they're labeled as such, sometimes they're very easy to compartmentalize. To say, okay, we're going to be ethical right now because we're in the ethics course. And the rest of the time, we kind of forget about all that stuff. I don't mean to be overly harsh, but I think that if we draw boundaries around those, rather than integrating them into the fabric of medical education, that we're actually doing ourselves and our students a bit of a disservice. So just thinking about ways in which this becomes business as usual, and that's really the most powerful way, I think, to change what we teach and what students learn.
So that's great, and it's actually an incredible segue into some of the questions that are coming into the Q&A portion. As we move into that space, I just want to take a moment and recognize and thank the partners that are joining us along with each of you as panelists, to say a thank you to you, each of you, and to say a thank you to the partners that made this possible and invited it, including the Words Festival, for the Peers for Peers program, the Department of English and Writing Studies, and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, along with just Western and LHSC in general. So to just acknowledge the collaborators and to actually intuitively move into one of the themes that's being represented in the questions, which is the relationship between what we're speaking of, resilience, compassion, noticing, and institutional trust. The relationship between resilience in those providing care and the institutional trust they have in the places in which they work. This is a theme through some of the questions. It's also one of the questions posed quite specifically from one of our partners. Would any of you like to take a stab at that?
I'll try, Shannon. I'm not sure I exactly understand the question, but I'm speculating.
Well, I can try and specify it a little bit.
Well, I wonder, does it have to do with, the injury that we experience when we work in a system that asks more than we can possibly give, and then that institution or system offers us a resilience course? Is that sort of what we're getting at?
Yes, as well as asking, but then, as I think one of the comments early, this hostile or opposing forces in the midst of the expectation that's being laid out.
So, I have some thoughts on that. I'm not sure if they're specifically going to answer the question. But the first thing that I personally do, and I now have the pleasure and the privilege of spending a significant portion of my time sharing what I have learned around mindfulness and resilience, and teaching aspects of Ron's program, as well as work of my own to groups of physicians. One of the first places that I think we often have to begin when we float in and we use the R word, resilience, or the M word, mindfulness, is we really have to lay the ground and start with kind of a disclaimer. And the two most important statements I think that I have to make to groups when I work with them, whether they're students or senior faculty, is that number one, that organizational factors are the primary drivers of burnout. The literature tells us that very clearly. They're not your failings, your inability to keep up. The primary drivers of burnout are organizational. And then the second piece of that is when we talk about resilience, the literature also tells us very clearly we don't have a resiliency deficit overall. Just again, talking about what the literature says about physicians, because that's the literature that I'm most familiar with. We don't have a resiliency deficit, we have a resiliency mismatch. So we work in an environment where we know that we have higher levels of resiliency than our age-matched controls, but the job that we do demands more than any group of humans can ever really do. I think of it as a bottomless pit that will just continue, no matter how higher levels of resilience we can be throwing them into this pit, and it will never be enough. So I think there are a couple of key things. First of all, we have to acknowledge that. That has to be one of the first statements that we make about how this work applies to individuals, or at least I think it's very helpful for counteracting what we often feel when people start by talking to us about resilience or mindfulness, which is rage, because they think what you're about to tell them, you're really ignoring an unmet need. They are drowning and you say, here's a Cheerio, and the offering is so discordant that people just feel further injury, further stress, further distress. So I guess one thing I think is that it is difficult. I'm interested to hear what Ron has to say about this, but when organizations offer, mindfulness programs or resiliency programs, that is fraught with problems, because unless you're doing a lot of other stuff as well to deal with so many of the other aspects that are destroying us, those other organizational and system pieces, people will just perceive that you're saying you're the problem, or you're doing the simplest thing that you can do, which are, typically in terms of rote offerings are mindfulness or resiliency programs, having someone come in and do a noon hour lecture, and you will just exacerbate people's hurt. So I would sort of begin to answer the question in that regard, that, and also, again, where do I find my locus of control? Why do I do this work? Because I do it for me. I do it because it makes my life better. I don't do it so my system, my hospital can, and not with no specific regards to my hospital, but any hospital can keep grinding me into a pulp, and can now grind me more thoroughly because I've had mindfulness training. I do it for me because it improves my quality of life, and it makes me stronger and more resilient so that I can help the other people that are stuck now, so I can survive this system for long enough to be some kind of influence within it that hopefully leaves it better. So that's not exactly answering the question, but it is beginning with the framing that I personally relate to the most, that this work is not to, the system addressing your deficits. This is a way to help ourselves out of the muck, to regain, again, that locus of control, to control what we can control, to most quickly to do the things that will, yield some results, as opposed to system change and efficiency of practice change. Both of those things are at glacial pace. So I'd be interested to hear what Ron has to say about that.
Well, there's never been such a thing as a good healthcare system. Things were pretty crappy in the 1980s when I was a medical student. The good old days were never good, and healthcare has always been disorganized, chaotic, and I mean, even Plato writes about healthcare in his day and didn't paint a very pretty picture of it. So I think we're always working in systems that have competing sets of values and that are chaotic and are not organized the way that we would do so. So I think part of it is a recognition of that, just acceptance that we're working in this murky place. And in the US, I think it's worse because of all the administrative stuff and insurance stuff and all of that, and disparities in care. So, and just not that you're accepting it in a sense of condoning it, but accepting that you're working in, you're trying to do good, but you're kind of slogging through muddy water, and it's just going to be muddy. So I think that it's a call to recognize the values that you can express, moments in which you're actually able to flourish, rather than just taking a negative view of getting rid of burnout, thinking about promoting flourishing. And those are not incompatible. So you can feel that, you can feel a sense of exhaustion, that you're working too hard, but also a sense that you're flourishing and that you're doing good in the world. So they're maybe orthogonal as opposed to antithetical. And also get angry enough so that you can be a needle in the side of the administration that's perpetuating what is fundamentally still a somewhat abusive system. And seniority gives you some benefits in the sense that it's harder to fire you. So I do recognize that it's hard to do when you're just starting out, but when you're in positions of leadership and some authority, rather than resting on your laurels, saying, this is my opportunity now to speak out, because the consequences for me personally, in terms of my career, are less than someone in a more vulnerable position. And so to have that degree of courage and recognition, I think, is important for those of us who've been in the system for longer.
Beautiful. And tying into that theme of sort of the evolution or lack thereof, I love your comment, the needle in the side. There's a question in the chat. I'll read it verbatim. As it relates to things as they evolve over time. The revolution of information brought about by the digital revolution has made attention increasingly scarce. As information increases, attention declines. This creates a potential conflict in medicine with the values expressed. What do the panelists have to say on how to ensure greater support for what's been called the attentional, it just disappeared. Sorry about that. The last.
Yeah, I see the question, the attentional commons. Yeah. First of all, I want to say a hello to Tom Freeman. I've not seen you in a very long time, so thank you for the question. I'll respond with a personal experience. We had a new electronic health record that was not designed well for the human brain, and so a lot of us were struggling with it. It had the capacity of capturing all of your attention. So once you got into it, it became very difficult to look away from the screen for a whole variety of reasons. And I was seeing a patient I had known for 20 years, and he kind of stopped me mid-sentence and said, I always liked coming here because you were such a good listener, but ever since you got this new computer system, I feel like you've been paying more attention to the screen than to. And he said that in not an accusatory way, but in a way I think he was truly trying to be helpful. And for me, that was like a dagger through my heart, because I do research on communication and medicine. That's what I'm known for. And here's someone saying that I had, at least for the moment, failed. And so at that point, I made a commitment to have the first 90 seconds of every encounter I had with a patient to be just for the patient. And just as an experiment, I thought, and I knew enough about communication that listening was important, but I just decided I was not going to turn the computer on. I was not going to look at the screen. I was not going to hold a pen, a piece of paper. And in fact, I was not going to try to fix anything. I would just spend the first 90 seconds just listening to that person's narrative and to see, first of all, if I finished the day any later, if what my mood was at the end of the day, if the quality of, it's an N of one experiment. It's not really rigorous scientific, But what I found was I didn't finish the day any later. I didn't have to ask patients questions more than once because I actually remembered what they said. That my notes were a bit more coherent, and that the computer was there in case I needed to look up a lab, or that 90 seconds didn't cost me much in terms of my what I knew about the patient. So for me, it felt like a radical act to not look at the screen. That was the odd part. I felt like I was, like having a meeting of the Communist Party in the US during the 1950s. You know, it was kind of like that kind of radical. And so I got a certain joy out of this, you know, some kind of rebellious joy, but it also just reminded me what's really important. And that listening piece is important. And so there are little, you know, little subversive acts that we can all do to try to counter this. And I think it's especially my kids, for example, my daughter's a medical student. She navigates electronic health records much better than I do. She can actually listen, and because this is what she grew up with, and part of it is a foreign thing. And I guess I'm optimistic, even though these systems are kind of clunky, that um, that younger brains probably are going to be able to do this a little bit better than our generation has. So
Great. Thank you so much for all
yeah.
that. This is a question coming at another angle of things. It's from an anonymous attendee. What advice do the speakers have for physicians who are doing everything possible to provide compassionate care to patients, but are faced with patient bias towards them, either discrimination indirectly or directly? Does anybody want to field that?
Well, I said that before we went on live, Shannon. I said that all the hard questions should go to Jill first. So
That's because he thinks I'm so capable. See, he's always giving me new opportunities. Exactly what a mentor should do. Thank you for helping me to continue to grow, Ron. This is, this is a really important question, and I think we all just paused for a moment, absorbing the gravity of it. And it's, just want to say that hearing that. That's heavy. And I think for a moment, even though we don't know your experience or specifically what you are alluding to, we can just not know, but perhaps again, using that compassionate imagination, know what you must be carrying. And, I would say a few things. A very wise mentor of mine, very early on, a different wise mentor than the two on the panel right now. Sharon Strauss is a physician in chief at Unity Health in Toronto, just an absolutely amazing woman. And one of the things, Sharon has really modeled for me as a clinician and as human is the concept of setting boundaries. And we forget that we do have, again, I keep talking about locus of control, but, are we doing everything that we can do? And again, not to put the onus on the person asking the question, because of course we also are, one thing we all deserve, that we're all worthy of, are psychologically safe environments that don't include abuse, intimidation, harassment. And I recognize, without knowing any details, that there are various factors that can put us in situations where it is hard to advocate for the safety we need. But just first of all, thinking of the principle that we are entitled to that is still a fundamental right. And the second thing, I am a big believer in removing ourselves from situations where we are experiencing abuse or harassment when that is possible. And again, I want to acknowledge there are many reasons, situations, scenarios that can make that very challenging. But, we do grow up in medicine in a culture where we are conditioned to tough it out, stick around, that we have to put up with certain things. Again, I recognize that certain situations, supervisions, job scenarios can make it very difficult financially, professionally, personally, to leave those situations. But that would be one of the principles that I have learned, is that sometimes we have to pull the only lever we can pull, which is leaving those situations. Now, again, I recognize if this individual, if they're experiencing, for example, systemic racism, that they are being exposed to this from patients, that's very hard. And we all know we can ask people to leave our practices. We can fire people from our practices, but it's heavy, it's complicated, it's painful. And our colleagues who deal with systemic racism as, a fundamental piece of the cognitive load that they have to deal with every single day, and whether that's racism, whether that's homophobia, transphobia, ableism, gender-related discrimination, it is a heavy load. So the one other thing I would say is do what you can to not carry it alone, to share that burden with someone, to seek mentorship from someone you can trust, who you think will, have at least some useful advice to give you about the problem. But remember to just recall that principle that we don't have to stay in some of these abusive and toxic environments that we've been conditioned to to stay in, rather, by virtue of the way that our training unfolds.
I would just like to add that this is an area in which the institution absolutely must have a policy, and that this is not to be tolerated. And obviously policies are words, but still and making that policy public, and not only to the medical staff but also to patients. And that's our institution actually did that just because of a few extremely difficult situations, but because just feeling that degree of support and saying, if this happens to you, this is the phone number you need to call, and you will never be blamed for reporting something like this. It won't ever come back to bite you. It won't result in the institution will stand by you if the patient is angry or sues or whatever. And I just think it's really strong as part of any anti-harassment policy, not only among workers, but also harassment from patients. And that you don't necessarily have to take care of that patient if it's anything but an absolute life-threatening immediate emergency. So
Wonderful.
there was a recent article about a physician who was examining a patient and discovered a Nazi swastika tattoo. And again, the physician was Jewish. What do you do? And so these things do come up with quite a bit of frequency.
Wonderful, so important.
Yeah.
I'd like to pose one of the other questions from the chat now from the other side of the coin as it relates to patients and their experience. But before I do so, Molly, I'm wanting to, in my role as moderator, make sure that all of you are having a chance to have your to be contributing to this conversation. Is there anything that's been coming up in the Q&A so far, Molly, that you had wanted to chime in on before we go to probably what I think will be a last question?
Oh, okay. Well, I have a sort of a non-Q&A remark that I'm going to sneak in, and then there is someone who posed a question in the Q&A that I thought was interesting. I just wanted to say that I too have obviously my Western University and London connection. My husband, Michael Groden, was a distinguished university professor at Western for decades, and it's great to see so many people from London in this audience, and to have you, Shannon, posing these questions, knowing that you're there in London, and also, since I'm from upstate New York, I have a Rochester connection too. So thanks, Jillian, for reaching out to both of your mentors in this way, and it is such a joy to listen to you respond to all of these issues on the panel this evening. And thanks, Shannon, also for formulating these questions. I just want to refer to Carla Harris's question. She says, whoops, I want to comment that I am a disabled poet writing about my experience with trauma. The discussion tonight has been so interesting, having come to rely on trauma-informed therapy and human connection for processing my emotions. And then she says, do you believe we can reach this point of success without adding mental health and peer support to our healthcare system to provide these services for free in tandem with our physical health care? And all I can say is, Carla, I am absolutely with you. I do feel that those mental health services, especially as they've been revealed to us through the pandemic, the necessity for them is so extreme. And obviously, we all need them. We have to address this in our healthcare system, even as we're addressing all of the other amazing pressures that are coming to bear. So thank you for that.
Lovely.
And I'll just add accessible, confidential, anonymous mental health services for all health professionals really should be part of the fabric of every healthcare institution. So.
That's great. And I thank you to each of you. I'm trying to balance whether we bring in one last question. So maybe if someone try to balance that and like just thanking everyone for being here tonight. There is, I think I have a motivation to provide a bit more room and time for the patients speaking in on our Q&A, people with a patient experience. And from Lyndon, there's a question regarding in this COVID time, interacting with medical professionals. And when there's nothing to fix and the stakes are high, the need for someone to just notice, and yet the reaction from the healthcare professional when they feel threatened, turning to politics or policy. And whether anybody on the panel has a thought about that experience, supporting a patient, having that experience, when the need is to notice, and yet the response is to turn to politics or policy. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Well, those are defensive responses, right? And it's an attempt to create order by narrowing your view of the world and affiliating with only those who agree with you, developing greater tribalism, shutting yourself off from any competing view of the world. That's difficult. First, it's important to understand that we all, at some level of threat, have those same initial responses. Okay, that and they're often irrational. We don't lock the door to our house during the daytime, but in the early days of the COVID pandemic, I found that I was locking the doors, as if locking the doors would keep the virus from coming in. And so we all engage in those responses. And so the first thing is just understanding that this is a normal human reaction to stress, an unexamined reaction. And then I think the second step is to not argue, but just present people with your humanness and your presence, and hope that some little crack will allow that human connection in. I know it sounds kind of desperate, but if you try to argue, that's just going to harden that defensive-ness. And so, we've been dealing with this with a lot of vaccine resistors here. And the advice now, which I think people took a while to get to, is you just don't argue. But you present your caring self, your present self, your accepting self, that their experience, as irrational as it might seem, is actually something that we all experience to some degree. And I often ask students, for example, have you ever done anything in your life that was not in the best interest of your own health? Okay, right? We all have. And if you think of it in that, and so what motivated you to do that one thing that was not in the best interest of your health? And how did you work your way through that, or are you still working with that?
Lovely, lovely, lovely. I'm unfortunately going to have to close things with us all, and I want to echo one of the comments that was put into the chat about this extraordinary panel, and thanking each of you. And what I actually really want to do is thank Josh, who it just so continuously and beautifully facilitates things and yet always in the background. And I really just want to bring him to the foreground. Josh and I have partnered on many events, and I don't think he loves the attention, and yet he really deserves it. And I wish to really thank him, his collaborators through the Words Festival, and his ability to bring this panel, specifically this panel, is because of him. And I wish to thank each of our panel members, Ron, Molly, Jillian, for being thoughtful and calm and wise in your, and so human in what you brought forward today to each other, to all of us, and to thank our partners as well. What a great evening.
Yeah. Thank you all. And I really appreciate being part of this. These kind of deep discussions are incredibly important. So thanks.
Totally agree. And just so lovely to share the stage with both of you, just cherished mentors and friends, just very grateful. And to you, Shannon, and again to Josh for holding this space, creating it and making it possible. Really lovely experience.
What a rare occasion to have such depth so immediately and then carried on for an hour and a half. So thank you, Josh and Sharon and Jillian and Ron.